Hello there, these are some things in history which have interested me. Now this is going to be a series of videos covering the Norman Conquest of England in 1066. Now this is a story that really I think could be said to begin in the year 1002. But before we get to that point, I think we should spend a little bit of time to cover the background, who are the people involved, and what are their relationships with each other. Now the first thing to notice if we go back to the early 9th century is that there actually is no such thing as England, at least not as a unified country. What there are is a series of smaller kingdoms ruled by German Anglo-Saxon elites. Now initially the most important of these kingdoms was the most northerly, Northumbria, but over time Northumbria lost that prominence. The most important one then was Mercia, in today what we would call the Midlands, and after that it descended down to the House of Wessex in the very south of England. Now one of the reasons for this shift southwards in terms of the cultural centre of English life was Viking raids. Now by this point the Anglo-Saxons themselves had become Christians. The Vikings though, they're still pagans, and they're going to come sweeping in from Scandinavia, sometimes trading, sometimes settling, but most famously of course raiding. One by one the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fall to these Viking invaders. Eventually they're stopped by Wessex, the Kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great. This in itself is a great story, but it's a story for another day. Eventually Wessex under Alfred and the Vikings agreed to divide the territory that we would call England between them. Wessex controlling most of the south and the Danes controlling most of the north in a region called the Danelaw. Now for a time things seemed to go very well. The Vikings in England begin to Christianise, and although Alfred himself does not recapture that lost territory, his descendants do. They maintain good relationships with Welsh leaders, and they even manage to capture territory from Scottish kings later on. Northern England still has a lot of Danish influence. The Danish language is spoken there, even though the people who live there now are Christians and subjects of an English king. Danish legal traditions persist. Basically there is still a very strong Danish flavour to that part of the English kingdom. Things really start to go wrong again in the 990s. A king called Athelred is on the throne of England at this point, Athelred II. The Vikings are back. After several decades with very little activity, they start raiding again in earnest, and this time without the leadership of a figure like Alfred, England is going to suffer. Part of the reason why these Viking raiders are going to be so successful is because they're receiving support from a group called the Normans. In an effort to peel away these Viking allies from that alliance, King Athelred in 1002 agrees to marry a Norman noblewoman. But who are these Normans? Normandy is a region in northern France. Although by this point in 1002 it was a duchy, it had originally been founded as a county, the county of Rouen, named after its most important city, the cathedral city of Rouen. The county of Rouen was most likely founded in the year 911 by a Viking leader, a pagan Viking leader called Hrolf, or Rollo as he's recorded in Latin script at the time. Now he has been raiding the country that we would today call France. In those days, more likely to be called Western Francia. The king of Western Francia in those days was called Charles the Simple, lots of these early French kings having very unflattering nicknames. His economy is in ruins. The Vikings have been raiding his territory for decades. He's been paying out literally many thousands of pounds of silver to try to buy them off, and he cannot afford to do that anymore. The Vikings have been sailing right up the Seine and besieging Paris. Lots of people have this impression of the Vikings as only being coastal raiders, and if you were inland you were probably safe. That's not true at all. They were capable of travelling vast distances inland. If you lived near a river, and if you lived in a town, you almost certainly did, you were within the reach of a Viking raid. What does Charles the Simple going to do? Well, what he decides to do is to try to co-opt Rolf and his Vikings and make them his vassals, make them work for him in the hope that they will defend Western Francia for him. He gives Rolf and his band land on the lower Seine, blocking off that seaborne route that the Vikings had previously been using to attack Paris. Rolf is to be the king's vassal, he is to become a Christian, and he takes the name Robert. Part of this business of becoming the king's vassal is performing what's called an act of homage. There's a story that may or may not be true associated with this story, but it's a good story, so I'll tell it. One of the things that Rolf was going to have to do to become Charles's vassal was bend over and kiss his foot. Rolf refuses to do this. He's simply not going to humble himself in that way, so he makes one of his Viking raiders do it instead. Instead of doing it in the normal humble way, this Viking raider walks up to the Western Frankish king, grabs his foot, hoists him high in the air, puts him flat on his back and kisses his foot that way. This doesn't bode entirely well for future relationship between the kings of France and these new Norman vassals. Another story that may or may not be true concerns the death of Rolf, or more accurately the funeral of Rolf. Now, as I mentioned before, as part of this deal, he was meant to have become a Christian. Some sources record him as having received a Viking boat burial. Virgins are sacrificed to him after his death, they put his body in a boat, they set it alight. This is not exactly a Christian burial practice or funeral practice. If it's true, that suggests that he wasn't exactly sincere in his conversion, but his heirs, the future dukes, would become very devout Christians by the standards of people of their time, which meant that they were not averse to killing, Christian or not. Now, rocky start or not, in many ways this arrangement seems to have worked extremely well. Charles the Simple got that protection he so desperately needed, and Rolf, or Rollo, got an opportunity to enjoy all the riches he'd acquired during his raiding career. Now, unlike the Danes in the Danelaw in northern England, these Normans abandoned their original culture very, very quickly. They're speaking French within a generation, they adopt French legal practices, and they lose most of their seafaring ability. Seafaring simply stops being so relevant to their lives. As Vikings, they're some of the finest seafarers that the world has ever seen. As Normans, the warfare they're going to need to participate on is going to be land-based, and they adopt and perfect Frankish heavy cavalry tactics. They become probably the best exponents of this type of warfare, not just in the territory where they live, but in Europe. And they learn how to build the Motte Bailey castles, the small wooden fortifications that, spoiler alert, will one day become a very important part of their tactics that they will use to control England. Later Counts of Rouen, or Dukes of Normandy after the year 996, they tend to have very adversarial relationships with pretty much everybody. They have adversarial relationships with future kings of France. They remain vassals of the kings of France, but often vassals in name only. They're very independent-minded, they follow their own politics, their own policies. They have adversarial relationships with the rest of the French nobility, their neighbours, and they also have adversarial relationships a lot of the time with each other. Very common to see miniature civil wars and all kinds of strife going on within the Norman territory and the Norman nobility. Their attention at this point is not focused on what's going on in England. The Vikings who remain raiders, now their attention has gone back to England, probably because they can no longer raid France as successfully as they had been doing previously. We're going to follow them, we're going to resume the story in England. It's the reign of King Athelred II. We'll take it from there and see how the events of his reign will not only lead to a second, more organised and successful Viking invasion, but also an even more successful and more lasting Norman invasion a little further down the line.